Hey there, today we're going to be looking at population statistics, a whole bunch of measures that determine whether the population of a given country is growing, decreasing, how quickly it's growing, and what that might mean for that country. So we're going to be going through quite a few terms. There are a lot of complicated, complex concepts within this set of notes. So make sure that at any time you need to pause the video and review your notes. Feel free to do so. Like it says on here, there's a lot of acronyms, so a lot of abbreviations and things like that. The first one, though, is a pretty straightforward one. It's called crude birth rate. So crude birth rate is basically the number of births per year. You take any 1,000 people and how many births are there in a given population of 1,000. So you'll notice on this map here that the places that are in darker red or orange are seeing quite a few births per year. Okay, the reason for that kind of being that in hundreds of years ago, if you went to if you were in the United States, right, people would have a ton of children, and that was because children were needed pretty often for working farm jobs and doing other chores and things like that. The other factor is that sadly, you can't expect all of the children that you have to grow into adulthood if you're living in a place that has less developed technology and medical care and things like that. So people are having quite a few children, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But you're looking at parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, seeing that the typical number of births per thousand people per year ends up being over 30 or maybe even over 40. Okay, whereas in the rest of the world we're talking about 8, maybe 15 or something like that. Okay, on the flip side we have what is called the crude death rate. Okay, so once again, number of deaths per year, and it's per thousand people. um, and the thing with this one is that, if you're looking at certain parts of the world, whether it's parts of the Middle East or whether it's parts of Africa, um, the death rate is pretty high, and it's because of a lack of medical care, lack of access to vaccinations, um, lack of food and water and things like that. If you're looking at a country that is pretty well developed, taking a look at, even the United States or most of Europe and Russia, or even looking at Japan especially, the death rate there is super high because not because of lack of medicine and things like that, but it's because there's so many old people. Okay, basically after World War II, the population started to grow and increase as people had a lot of kids as people returned back from the war. Um, those babies, right, it's the baby boomer generation, are growing up and growing old, and so that is leading, 75 years later, now in the year 2020, the death rate in some of those places is actually pretty high. So again, you have to see, crude death rate is one of those statistics that's not always able to tell you the full story, right? Because the death rate could be high, and it could be because of just people living super super long, and eventually, they're dying off because of that. Okay. When you put the two together, basically you take births minus deaths, you get if there's more births in a year than there are deaths, obviously you're going to see population growth. Okay, so the rate at which the population is growing is called the natural increase rate. You take, like I said, you take the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. If you want to turn that into a percentage, all you got to do is just move the decimal over one place, and boom, you got one. So, as an example, it says if country A has a CBR of 40 and a crude death rate of 15, you just take 40 births minus 15 deaths, 25, move the decimal over, 2.5. 2.5% increase rate per year would be really high, actually. You notice on this map, right, the orange range is 2.5. Anything that's darker red is looking at like a 3 to 4% increase per year to the population. You might think, well, 3%, that can't be that much, but if the United States had a 3% increase rate, that would mean we take our population of 300 million, and you take 3% of that, which would be I think 3 million, if I'm doing the math correctly on that one. And then, I mean, that would just be a really quick growth rate, right? So, if you have a very rapid rate of growth, a very quick growth rate, you end up having the potential to double your population super quickly. That would not be a good thing, right? If you think about our entire world, if our entire world's population doubled, there'd be no way to feed everyone. Um, there'd be no way to sustain that, okay? We'd run out of resources. Now, thankfully, the world's population is not doubling, probably ever. Most scientists think that our population will probably cap out at about 11 million, or 11 billion, and then that's when it will kind of reach its peak and start to kind of flatten out. But there are parts of the world where the population, because of the growth rate, because of having so many kids, that doubling time is actually fairly quick. So the amount of time it will take for a country's population to double, it's kind of arbitrary, this number 70. So if you're like, why 70? Just roll with it. That's just a mathematical thing. So you take the number 70 and then you divide it by the growth rate. So for example, Canada is growing at a rate of 0.9% per year. So that's less than 1% growth per year. That's very minimal. All right. So if you take that random number 70, you divide it by 0.9, it gives you 78, okay? 78 means 78 years that it would take to double Canada's population. So if we go into the future, it's the year 2098, maybe Canada's population will be twice the size. Now, that takes into account the current growth rate. So 15, 20 years from now, if people are starting to have fewer and fewer kids yet, well, then Canada's growth rate could be down to 0.5 or 0.4, and then you would have to recalculate the doubling time, and it could be pretty long. You go to some places that literally have a population decline. They have more deaths than they have births. For example, Russia, the doubling time is literally considered to be infinite because in theory, it would never, ever double at the rate that it's currently going, okay? So, short doubling time would be most of these places, right? Once again, any of these countries that have a large natural increase rate are going to also have a quick doubling time, all right? Along the same lines here now, we're looking at what's called total fertility rate. Okay, it's a fancy way of saying the number of children that the average woman is expected that she would have during her lifetime. Okay, so during the average lifetime, it depends on which country you're in. Obviously, the global average used to be as high as 5. Well, it used to be even higher than that probably, but in 1970 it was 5. The average woman in the world would be expected to probably have up to 5 children during her lifetime. These days, the average woman in the world is having 2.5 children. Obviously, you can't have a half children, it's an average. So, what happens here is, let's take a look real quick. The United States, for example, I think our total fertility rate in the U.S. is around 2.4. So the average woman has 2.4 children. If you took every woman and you took all the number of kids that every woman has in her lifetime, you average it out, it comes down to about 2.4. Okay, so it says here the replacement rate. Okay, replacement rate is the fertility rate that would be needed to maintain a population and to achieve what's called zero population growth. Right? It just makes sense. If you have this many deaths, then you would need exactly this many births to keep that leveled out, right? So if you have 1 million people that die in a year, then you need 1 million babies to kind of level that out. That's called the replacement rate. So if the death rate is one level, then you need to have that total fertility rate that's going to reach that level to kind of even it out. Okay, so the global average the global replacement level average is 2.33 in the world. Okay. Again, you see that the total fertility rate is super high here in sub-Saharan Africa, where people, or I should say, where women are having on average, 5, 6, even 7 children. And again, that mostly comes down to the fact that children are needed for doing things like farming and chores and sustaining the family and things like that. Okay, so there are other factors as well. Lack of access to birth control, contraception. It's lack of education or schooling, lack of family planning, things like that. If those things aren't really talked about, if those things aren't readily available, that's another thing that's going to lead to a higher birth rate or a higher total fertility rate. Okay, we got 2 more terms to go through here. Excuse me. The first being the bleakest, saddest statistic that you're going to come across in this class, unfortunately. And that is what is known as the infant mortality rate. So it's the number of infant deaths in a country per 1,000 live births, so the baby has to be born live. But if the baby does not make it to the first year, they are considered part of this statistic, this very sad statistic called the infant mortality rate. Okay. You'll notice that if we looked again at some of these sub-Saharan African countries where they don't have great access to medical care, where you can't be guaranteed a birth that's taking place in a hospital, a lot of these women are living in villages that are very far from the nearest hospital or medical center, and so they're forced to give birth right there with whatever materials and resources that they have available. And that can a lot of times endanger the health of not only the baby but also the mother too. And so you see that you're going to have a pretty high infant mortality rate, unfortunately. Now it is decreasing in all parts of the world as people do get more access to those sort of medical supplies and things like that. But you can see here the darkest colors on this chart, or on this map I should say, this choropleth map, show that out of 1,000 births, some of these places are seeing 150, 160 infant deaths per 1,000, right? That's a 15% rate, 15% of babies not surviving. Okay. Now you look at this chart over here, you can see this is like the most developed countries or the wealthiest countries. You can see that a lot of them are keeping that rate down to as low as 2 or 3 per 1,000. The United States, though, kind of lags behind at 6 per 1,000. Now, again, you compare that to like the Central African Republic or Democratic Republic of the Congo or something like that. 6 is a whole lot lower than 150. But when you compare it to Finland and Japan, for example, the U.S. has triple the infant mortality rate. So still some work to be done. And then the last one, I think this is probably the most straightforward of the statistics. It's probably the one that you're most likely to have already heard about, so I won't spend much time on it. But life expectancy, right? The amount of years a person can expect to live based on their demographics at the time of their birth. Demographics means, are you male, female? What is your race or ethnicity, right? In a lot of countries, sadly, that does play into things. The global average, as you can see, as of the time of this map, I don't know, it might be 5 years outdated, but the global average life expectancy was around 70. It might now be maybe 71 or 72. But in every part of the world, it has increased pretty significantly over the last 20, 30, 40 years as medical improvements have been made and as people have gained access to just better nutrition, vaccinations, just overall better quality of life in all these places. But you can still see, life expectancy has some work to do to gain ground in various parts of the world. So that's a lot of stuff, and I totally understand, but just make sure that you are going back through, pausing the video as much as you needed to do that, and make sure that you're paying attention to these different statistics. So double check with me if you have any questions, and take care.